Montana Territory, autumn of 1882. The town of Blackwater Creek wasn't much to look at, a scattering of buildings clinging to the edge of the wilderness like survivors of a shipwreck. Perched between the mountains and the vast plains, it was the kind of place folks only found if they were truly lost or desperately trying to disappear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. And Sarah Mason had done exactly that. Few knew her story, fewer dared to ask, but all of them would soon witness what happens when a woman with nothing left to lose finally takes a stand. When the Wallace gang rode into town that fateful October morning, they thought they'd found another easy target. Just a quiet widow running a struggling trading post with nothing but an ancient rifle hanging above her door. They didn't know that rifle had never missed a shot in her hands. They were about to learn. Blackwater Creek sat in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains, a forgotten patch of civilization where Montana Territory stretched toward the darkening sky. Autumn had painted the aspens gold against the evergreens, but the beauty did little to soften the harshness of life on the frontier. The town consisted of little more than 2 dirt roads that crossed at a dusty intersection, Main Street running east to west and Church Street running north to south. Though the church itself had burned down 3 winters ago, the buildings huddled together against the coming cold. Mason's trading post, Sullivan's saloon, a small hotel run by the widow, Harrington, the sheriff's office, Dr. Peterson's combined home and medical practice, and a scattering of homes that had seen better days. Beyond the town limits, scattered homesteads dotted the landscape, most struggling against the unforgiving land. The creek that gave the town its name snaked along the northern edge, running dark and swift with mountain snowmelt and mineral deposits that stained the stones black. Old-timers claimed the water brought bad luck to those who drank it, but folks drank it anyway. In Blackwater Creek, you took what you could get. The wind whistled through the gaps in the weathered buildings, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. At the eastern edge of town, Mason's trading post stood apart from the others, a sturdy 2-story structure of dark timber that had weathered 20 Montana winters. The wide porch faced the main road, providing a clear view of anyone approaching. From either direction, inside, lanterns cast a warm glow over shelves stocked with essential supplies, sacks of flour, coffee beans, ammunition, tools, and the occasional luxury items from back east. A pot-bellied stove radiated heat in the center of the room, surrounded by a few chairs where travelers could warm themselves before continuing their journey. The wood floors, worn smooth by years of boots, creaked with each step, announcing every visitor long before they reached the counter. Behind that counter stood Sarah Mason, her hands moving methodically as she inventoried supplies in a leather-bound ledger. At 42, her face held the weathered lines of someone who had seen too much too soon, but her posture remained straight as a fence post, unbending despite everything life had thrown at her. Her chestnut hair, streaked with silver at the temples, was pulled back in a practical braid that hung down her back. She wore a simple blue cotton dress beneath a well-worn leather apron, her sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms, strong from years of work. Sarah's movements were efficient, economical, nothing wasted. 8 years she'd run this trading post alone. 8 years since Thomas had been laid to rest on the hillside beyond town. 8 years of survival, one day at a time. Above the door hung an old Kentucky long rifle, its wooden stock darkened with age and polish, brass fittings gleaming in the lamplight. It wasn't a decorative piece. Anyone who looked closely could see it was well maintained, the barrel free of dust, the action oiled. Locals knew better than to comment on it, but newcomers often made the mistake of asking why such an outdated weapon held such a place of honor when newer, faster guns were available. Sarah rarely bothered to explain. Let them think about what they wanted. The rifle stayed where it was, within reach, but out of the way, like a silent guardian. The bell above the door jangled as Sheriff William Cooper pushed his way inside, stamping his boots on the threshold to knock off the dust. At 55, Cooper was lean and weathered, his once black hair now mostly grey beneath his wide-brimmed hat. His badge, pinned to a wool vest, caught the light as he approached the counter. "Afternoon, Sarah," he said, removing his hat. "Just making my rounds." Sarah nodded, not looking up from her ledger. "Sheriff." Cooper leaned against the counter, his eyes drifting to the shelves behind her. "Running low on supplies? Supply wagons?" "3 weeks late," she replied, making another notation. "Johnson promises they'll be here by week's weekend." "What did he say last week?" Sarah's pen paused. "And the week before?" She finally looked up, her grey-green eyes meeting him. "Something on your mind, Cooper?" The sheriff sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Got word from Helena yesterday. The Wallace gang hit another settlement up north. Emptied the general store. Shot the owner when he tried to stop them." Sarah's expression didn't change, but her grip on the pen tightened slightly. "They're moving south, then?" "Appears so." Cooper's gaze drifted to the rifle above the door. "Might be nothing, but thought you should know. Appreciate the warning." Sarah returned to her ledger, the conversation clearly over as far as she was concerned. Cooper replaced his hat, hesitated, then added, "They've got 5 riders now. Picked up some young hothead in Butte." "More fools don't make for better odds," Sarah replied without looking up. "Just makes for more noise." The sheriff chuckled despite himself. "Suppose that's true. Still, I might want to close up early these next few days, at least until we know they've moved on. Been closing this store at the same time for 8 years? Cooper, don't plan on changing that now." Cooper recognized the steel in her voice, knew there was no point arguing. He nodded, tipped his hat and headed for the door. He paused with his hand on the knob, looking back. Thomas would have wanted, "You safe, Sarah?" For a moment, something flickered across Sarah's face, a shadow of something deeper than the stoic expression she usually wore. Then it was gone, replaced by the same unreadable mask. "Thomas isn't here," she said simply. "I am." After Cooper left, Sarah continued her inventory, but her mind had drifted to the past. Thomas had built this trading post with his own hands when they'd first arrived in Blackwater Creek, full of dreams about a new life on the frontier. He'd been dead 12 years now, killed by a stray bullet during a drunken dispute outside Sullivan's saloon. The shooter had fled town that same night, never to be seen again. Sarah had buried her husband and her dreams on the same day. The trading post had been their shared vision. Now it was her lifeline. The bell jangled again, pulling Sarah from her thoughts. Abigail Peterson stepped inside, her medical bag clutched in one hand. At 35, the doctor was one of the few educated women in the territory, having studied back east before the war. Her blonde hair was pinned up neatly beneath a practical hat, her clothes simple but well-made. "Thought I might find the sheriff here," she said, setting her bag on the counter. "Just missed him," Sarah replied. "Something wrong?" Abigail shook her head. "Just some supplies I ordered. Wanted to know if they'd arrived with the mail." "Nothing yet." Sarah closed her ledger. "Coffee, please." Sarah moved to the stove, where a pot of coffee simmered throughout the day. She poured 2 cups, sliding one across the counter to Abigail, who accepted it gratefully. "Heard about the Wallace gang?" Abigail asked after taking a sip. Sarah nodded. "Cooper just told me. They say the leader, Nathaniel Wallace, killed his first man at 16. Abigail's voice dropped. "Shot him in the back over a card game. Men. Like that don't impress me," Sarah replied, her tone flat. "Cowards with guns, thinking it makes them important." Abigail studied her friend over the rim of her cup. "Cooper's worried they might come here. Cooper worries about a lot of things. This time he might be right." Abigail set her cup down. "This town's isolated. Easy target." Sarah's gaze drifted to the rifle above the door. "Let them come." Something in her tone made Abigail pause. Most folks in town knew little about Sarah's life before Blackwater Creek. She'd arrived with Thomas 20 years ago, already carrying herself with that same quiet dignity and reserve. There were rumors, of course. There always were in small towns. But Sarah had never confirmed nor denied any of them. "I've been meaning to ask," Abigail said carefully. "That rifle of yours, family heirloom?" Sarah's expression softened slightly. "My father's. He taught me to shoot with it when I was 8 years old." 8? That's young. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Not where I grew up." Sarah's eyes took on a distant look. "Pa said a girl should know how to protect herself in a world that wouldn't always be kind." Wise man. He was. Sarah's fingers traced an invisible pattern on the counter. "Died in 53. Cholera." Abigail nodded sympathetically. Death was a constant companion on the frontier. Few families remained untouched by its reach. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The light was beginning to fade, the short autumn day giving way to evening. Sarah glanced at the small clock on the shelf behind her. "Should be closing up soon," she said. Abigail finished her coffee. "I should get back. Mrs. Thornton's time is getting close." As the doctor gathered her things, the door opened again. Marcus Sullivan, owner of the town's only saloon, stepped inside, his bulk filling the doorframe. At 48, Sullivan had the ruddy complexion of a man who sampled his own wares too often, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Ladies," he said, nodding to them both. "Sarah, got a moment?" Abigail took the hint. "I'll check back tomorrow about those supplies," she said to Sarah, then nodded to Sullivan as she left. Sullivan waited until the door closed behind the doctor before speaking. "Cooper came by the saloon, told me about the Wallace gang. Seems he's making the rounds," Sarah replied, gathering the coffee cups. "Got me thinking." Sullivan shifted his weight. "Last time we had trouble, those cattle rustlers 3 years back, we formed a town watch. Might be worth doing again." Sarah set the cups down. "And who would you have watched, Marcus?" "Harrison's too old. Peterson's needed for medical emergencies. And the Cooper brothers can barely stay awake during Sunday service." Sullivan's mouth twitched. "Got 4 men willing to stand night shifts, 2 at each end of town." "Armed with what? Pitchforks?" "They've got rifles." "And how many have actually fired one at something other than a deer?" Sullivan hesitated. "That's not the point." "It's exactly the point." Sarah crossed her arms. "You put inexperienced men with guns against killers, all you'll get is more graves to dig." The saloon keeper's expression hardened. "So what would you suggest? Just wait for them to ride in and take whatever they want?" Sarah's gaze drifted to the rifle above the door. "I'm suggesting we don't make ourselves easy targets. Lock doors, keep valuables hidden, and don't try to be heroes." Sullivan studied her for a long moment. "There's something about you, Sarah Mason. Always has been. Like you've seen things the rest of us haven't." She met his gaze steadily. "We've all seen things, Marcus. Some of us just remember the lessons better than others." After Sullivan left, Sarah finished closing the store. She moved methodically around the space, checking windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. The routine was comforting. The same actions, day after day, a form of control in a world that often offered none. Upstairs in her living quarters, Sarah lit the lamp on her small table. The room was Spartan but comfortable. A bed, a dresser, a rocking chair near the window that overlooked the main street. On the dresser sat a daguerreotype of Thomas, his serious expression softened by the slight curve of his lips. Beside it lay a smaller image in an ornate silver frame, carefully positioned face down. Sarah picked up the frame, turning it over slowly. A young girl stared back at her, no more than 5 years old, with Sarah's eyes and Thomas's smile. Emily, there. Daughter lost to fever the winter before Thomas's death. Some days, Sarah could barely remember her face. Other days, the memory was so vivid, it felt like physical pain. She set the frame down gently, then moved to the window. The main street lay quiet in the gathering darkness, lanterns beginning to glow in windows along its length. In the distance, she could see the lights of Sullivan's Saloon, the only building still fully awake at this hour. Sarah's gaze drifted upward to the stars emerging in the clear Montana sky. The same stars she'd watched as a girl in Kentucky, where her father had first placed the long rifle in her small hands and taught her to respect its power. The same stars she'd followed west with Thomas, full of hope for their future. The same stars that had witnessed everything she'd lost, and perhaps everything she still had left to give. As she turned from the window, her eyes fell on the old wooden chest at the foot of her bed. She hadn't opened it in years, and had no reason to, but tonight something pulled her toward it. Sarah knelt before the chest, running her fingers along the worn edges before lifting the heavy lid. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, lay her past. A past she'd packed away long ago. Sarah unwrapped the bundle slowly, revealing a worn leather belt with holsters on each hip. The twin Remington revolvers gleamed in the lamplight, their pearl handles yellowed with age but still beautiful. Beneath them lay a stack of yellowed, wanted posters, the topmost bearing an illustration of a young woman with a determined expression and a reward of $500 for her capture. The name printed below the illustration read, Sarah Hollister, alias Deadeye Hollister. Sarah touched the paper gently, tracing the outline of a face she barely recognized anymore. Long before she was Sarah Mason, shopkeeper's wife and widow of Blackwater Creek, she had been someone else entirely. Someone even the Wallace gang would have thought twice about crossing. She rewrapped the guns and posters, returning them to the chest. No need for those yet. The rifle would be enough if it came to that. It always has been. As she closed the chest, Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. 8 years of quiet existence in Blackwater Creek had dulled her edges, but hadn't broken her. If trouble was coming, she would meet it head-on, as she always had. Let them come, she thought again. Let them come. Dawn broke over Blackwater Creek with streaks of pink and gold painting the eastern sky. The town awakened slowly, reluctantly, like a bear emerging from hibernation. Smoke curled from chimneys as fires were stoked to ward off the morning chill. The scent of coffee and wood smoke mingled in the crisp autumn air. Sheriff William Cooper made his first rounds before sunrise, a habit formed during 30 years of wearing a badge. He walked the length of Main Street, boots crunching on the hard-packed dirt, eyes scanning for anything out of place. The town felt different this morning, quieter, more watchful. Word about the Wallace gang had spread quickly, as news always did in small communities. Cooper paused outside Mason's trading post. Light already glowed behind the curtained windows, a sign that Sarah was awake and moving about. She always rose. With the sun, another habit that hadn't changed in all the years he'd known her. He hesitated before continuing on his way. Something about his conversation with Sarah yesterday still nagged at him. Her calm in the face of potential danger wasn't surprising. She'd always been steady as bedrock, but there had been something else in her eyes when he mentioned the Wallace gang. Not fear. Something colder, more focused. Cooper had served as sheriff in 3 different territories over his long career. He'd developed a sense for people, could usually tell the difference between those who talked brave and those who lived it. Sarah Mason fell firmly in the latter category, though he'd never quite understood why. A shopkeeper's widow shouldn't have eyes that assess threats like a veteran soldier. The sheriff tipped his hat to Harrison Wells as the elderly postmaster, unlocked the door to the small building that served as both post office and telegraph station. Harrison nodded back, his arthritic hands fumbling slightly with his keys. "Any word from Helena?" Cooper asked. Harrison shook his head. "Lines went down yesterday. Storm up north, most likely." Cooper frowned. With the telegraph down, they were. Even more isolated than usual. "Let me know when it's back up." "Will do, Sheriff." Harrison paused. "Heard about those outlaws. You think they're really headed this way?" "Just being cautious," Cooper replied, not wanting to fuel the rumors already circulating. "No need for alarm." Harrison snorted. "Tell that to the Petersons. Doctor's husband was cleaning his shotgun half the night. Could hear him loading and unloading the damn thing from my place." Cooper suppressed a sigh. James Peterson was a scholarly man, more comfortable with books than firearms. The thought of him trying to defend the town with a shotgun was concerning. "I'll have a word with him." "You do that." Harrison disappeared inside the post office, the door closing behind him with a familiar creak. Cooper continued his rounds, nodding to the few townspeople already about their morning business. By the time he returned to his office, the sun had fully cleared the horizon, casting long shadows across the street. Inside, he found his deputy, Frank Mitchell, dozing in a chair, boots propped on the desk. At 26, Mitchell was eager but inexperienced, the son of an old friend who had asked Cooper to give the boy a chance after he'd gotten into trouble in Butte. "Wake up," Cooper said sharply. Mitchell startled, nearly toppling backwards in his chair. "Sorry, Sheriff, just rested my eyes." "Save it for your off hours." Cooper hung his hat on a peg by the door. "Any trouble last night?" "Quiet as a church." Mitchell straightened his rumpled clothes. "Except for a fight at Sullivan's around midnight. Just miners blowing off steam." Cooper nodded, unsurprised. "Anyone hurt?" "Nothing serious." Sullivan broke it up before it got out of hand. "Good." Cooper moved to the small stove in the corner, pouring himself coffee from the pot Mitchell had prepared earlier. It was bitter and overboiled, but it was hot. "I want you to make an extra round this afternoon. Check the outlying properties, too." Mitchell's expression brightened at the prospect of additional responsibility. "You really think the Wallace gig might come here?" "I think it pays to be prepared." Cooper sipped his coffee, hiding a grimace at the taste. "And I need you sharp, not jumping at shadows. These men aren't to be taken lightly." "I heard Nathaniel Wallace once shot a man just for looking at him wrong," Mitchell said, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Cooper fixed him with a stern look. "Whatever you've heard, the reality is worse. Wallace and his men don't leave witnesses, and they don't show mercy. If they come, and that's still an if, we avoid confrontation if possible." Mitchell's enthusiasm dampened. "But it's our job to protect the town." "Our job is to keep people alive," Cooper corrected. "Sometimes that means knowing when not to draw your gun." The deputy looked like he wanted to argue but thought better of it. "Yes, sir." Cooper finished his coffee and set the cup down. "Get some sleep. I need you back here at noon, clear-headed." After Mitchell left, Cooper sat heavily at his desk, the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders once more. The wanted posters for the Wallace gang were spread before him. 5 faces, 5 names, 5 prices. Nathaniel Wallace's bounty had reached $1,000, dead or alive. His brother Jeremiah was worth almost as much. Cooper had faced outlaws before, but never with such limited resources. Blackwater Creek had exactly 2 lawmen, himself and Mitchell, plus whatever volunteers he could muster if trouble came. Against experienced killers, those weren't odds he liked. His gaze strayed to the window toward Mason's trading post down the street. Sarah's words from yesterday echoed in his mind. "More fools don't make for better odds." She was right, of course. Quality mattered more than quantity in a fight. The sheriff found himself wondering, not for the first time, what Sarah Mason's story really was. 20 years in Blackwater Creek, and she remained as much a mystery as the day she arrived. Thomas had been forthcoming enough, a former Union soldier looking for a fresh start after the war. But Sarah had always kept to herself, polite but distant. Cooper had respected their privacy. Now, with potential danger approaching, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Sarah Mason than met the eye. Across town, Marcus Sullivan wiped down the bar of his saloon, preparing for the day ahead. The place wouldn't open until noon, but there was always work to be done. Glasses to clean, floors to sweep, stock to inventory. 20 years he'd owned the watering hole, building it from a rough tent, serving rot-gut whiskey, to miners into a proper establishment with a real wooden bar and decent spirits. The saloon had weathered boom and bust cycles, survived the departure of the mining companies when the local veins played out, and adapted as Blackwater Creek transitioned from mining camp to proper settlement. Sullivan had survived too, transforming from a hot-headed young man seeking fortune to a respected business owner with a stake in the community's future. As he worked, Sullivan's mind kept returning to his conversation with Sarah the previous day. Her dismissal of his town watch idea still rankled. She wasn't wrong about the men's inexperience, but doing nothing seemed worse. The back door opened, and Eliza Barnes entered, carrying a basket of fresh bread. At 38, Eliza had been working for Sullivan for nearly a decade, cooking meals for hungry miners and travelers, and helping manage the saloon's day-to-day operations. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her brown eyes missed nothing. "Morning," she said, setting the basket on the bar. "Smelled trouble when I walked in." "What's got you scowling so early?" Sullivan huffed. "Sarah Mason talked to her yesterday about organizing some protection for the town, and she all but laughed in my face." Eliza raised an eyebrow. "Since when does Sarah's opinion bother you so much? You two have been butting heads for years." "This is different." Sullivan folded his cleaning rag with uncharacteristic precision. "Cooper says the Wallace gang might be headed this way." The humor left Eliza's expression. "How certain is he?" "Certain. Enough to make the rounds yesterday, warning folks." Sullivan glanced toward the window. "The telegraph's down too. We're on our own out here." Eliza was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "And Sarah doesn't think a town watch is..." "The answer?" "Says we'll just get ourselves killed." Sullivan's jaw tightened. "Maybe she's right about most of the men in town, but I wasn't always just a saloon keeper." "I know that, Marcus." Eliza's voice softened. "But that was a long time ago. Before purchasing the saloon, Sullivan had ridden with a volunteer militia during the border disputes of the 1850s. He wasn't a stranger to violence, though those days were far behind him now. "Some things you don't forget," he muttered. Eliza studied him for a moment, then sighed. "What does Cooper say?" "Same as Sarah. Caution, don't provoke, hide the valuables." Sullivan's frustration was evident. "Like lying down and showing our throats to wolves." "There's wisdom in picking your battles," Eliza replied, moving behind the bar to help him prepare for the day. "Besides, what do we have worth dying for? A few bottles of whiskey? Some cash in the till?" "It's the principle," Sullivan insisted. "This is our town." Eliza's expression turned thoughtful. "You know, for someone who claims to dislike Sarah, you two are remarkably similar." Sullivan bristled. "We're nothing alike." "No?" Eliza smiled slightly. "Both stubborn as mules. Both are protective of this town in their own ways. Both carry something from your past that you don't talk about." "You don't know what you're talking about," Sullivan muttered, but there was no heat in his words. "I've worked for you for 10 years, Marcus. I know you better than you think." Eliza began arranging glasses on the shelf. And I've watched Sarah Mason handle drunks and troublemakers in her store without breaking a sweat. There's more to that. Woman than meets the eye. Sullivan couldn't argue with that. He'd seen Sarah face down angry miners twice her size without flinching. Once 3 years back, when a drifter had tried to rob her store, she'd simply stared him down until he'd backed away, mumbling apologies. Not once had she reached for that old rifle above her door, but something in her stance had made it clear she could have and would have, if necessary. Maybe, he conceded, but I still say we need to do something. Eliza nodded toward the window where they could see people moving up and down the street, going about their daily business. Look at them, Marcus. They've survived blizzards, disease, and the collapse of the mines. They'll survive this too, one way or another. Sullivan wished he shared her confidence. But he'd heard stories about the Wallace gang, how they'd burned a trading post in Wyoming territory with the owner still inside, how they'd shot a young deputy in Idaho just to watch him die. Men like that didn't just rob and leave. They enjoyed the destruction they caused. Hope you're right, he said finally, but I'm keeping my shotgun loaded just the same. At the far end of Main Street, Dr. Abigail Peterson washed her hands in a basin of warm water, the scent of carbolic soap sharp in the small examination room. She'd been up most of the night with Martha Thornton, who had delivered a healthy baby girl just before dawn. Mother and child were resting now, while Abigail prepared for her regular morning appointments. Her husband, James, entered quietly, carrying a cup of coffee. At 40, James Peterson had the disheveled appearance of a man more comfortable with books than practical matters. His spectacles sat slightly askew on his nose, and his brown hair, streaked with premature grey, was perpetually rumpled. "Thought you could use this," he said, offering the cup. Abigail accepted it gratefully. "Thank you. Did you get any sleep?" James shook his head. "Too much on my mind." He hesitated. "I was cleaning the shotgun last night. I heard." Abigail sipped her coffee. Harrison probably heard it too, and the Sullivans. Possibly even the Wallace gang, wherever they are. James had the grace to look embarrassed. "I just want to be prepared." "I know." Abigail's expression softened. "But you don't need to worry about me. I can take care of myself." "Against professional. Killers." James's voice rose slightly. "Abby, these men, I know who they are," she interrupted gently. "But panicking won't help." James removed his spectacles, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I should never have brought you to this godforsaken place." Abigail set down her coffee cup. "We've had this conversation before. I chose to come here, same as you." It was an old argument. James had accepted a position as the school teacher in Blackwater Creek 5 years ago, drawn by the promise of building a proper school in the frontier town. Abigail had followed, establishing her medical practice, despite initial resistance from some of the more traditional residents. Together, they represented the town's commitment to education and progress, though the realities of frontier life often challenged their Eastern sensibilities. "I know," James sighed. "I just worry." "As do I." Abigail squeezed his hand. "But Sarah's right, we can't make ourselves targets. You spoke with her yesterday at the trading post." Abigail resumed preparing her instruments for the day ahead. She seemed different, focused. James adjusted his spectacles. "Different how?" Abigail considered the question. "It's hard to explain. Sarah's always been reserved, but yesterday there was something else, like she was assessing possibilities, making plans." "For what?" "I'm not sure." Abigail arranged her stethoscope and other tools on a clean cloth. "But I got the impression she's faced situations like this before." James frowned. "She's a shopkeeper's widow." "She's a survivor," Abigail corrected. "There's a difference." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. James went to answer it, returning a moment later with Betsy Collins, a young woman expecting her first child. "We'll continue this later," Abigail said quietly to her husband before turning to greet her patient. After James left, Abigail focused on her examination, checking Betsy's progress and answering her questions about the upcoming birth. But part of her mind remained on Sarah Mason and the quiet strength she'd displayed yesterday. In the 5 years since moving to Blackwater Creek, Abigail had developed a cautious friendship with the widow. They weren't close. Sarah didn't seem to let anyone truly close, but they respected each other as independent women in a place where such independence was rare. Over time, Abigail had noticed things. The way Sarah's eyes constantly scanned, her surroundings, the precise way she moved, the fact that she never seemed startled or surprised. Once, when helping Sarah tend to a minor cut on her arm, Abigail had noticed other scars, old, long-healed wounds that looked suspiciously like bullet grazes. Sarah had pulled down her sleeve quickly, changing the subject, and Abigail hadn't pressed the issue. Everyone in Blackwater Creek had secrets after all. But now, with danger potentially approaching, Abigail found herself wondering just what Sarah Mason was capable of. By mid-morning, Sarah Mason had already served a dozen customers, each one bringing the same questions. Were the rumors true? Was the Wallace gang really coming? What were they going to do? Sarah offered the same measured responses to each. Nothing was certain. Sheriff Cooper was aware of the situation. The best thing to do was remain calm and go about normal business. What she didn't say was what she had done before opening the store that morning. She didn't mention the hour spent on the ridge behind her home, the ancient Kentucky rifle in her hands, practicing shots she hadn't taken in years. She didn't speak of the satisfying thud as each bullet found its mark, or how her hands remembered the rifle's weight and balance, as if no time had passed at all. Some skills once learned stayed in the blood. The bell above the door jangled once more, and Sarah looked up to see Lily Harrington enter the store. At 65, Lily was one of Blackwater Creek's original settlers, having arrived with her late husband during the first mining boom 30 years prior. She now ran the small hotel with her grandson Michael, a quiet young man of 22. "Morning, Lily," Sarah greeted her. "The usual," Lily nodded, placing her basket on the counter. "Coffee, sugar, and some of that cinnamon if you've still got it." Sarah gathered the items, mentally calculating the total. "How's business at the hotel?" "Had 2 travelers stop yesterday. Salesman heading to Helena." Lily watched Sarah measure coffee beans into a paper sack. "They left this morning, in quite a hurry too, after hearing about the Wallace gang." Sarah tied the sack closed. "People talk too much. Can't help it in a small town." Lily lowered her voice. "Is it true what they're saying about what they did in Cedar Ridge?" "I don't put much stock in rumors," Sarah replied evenly. Lily studied her for a moment. "You know, Sarah, in all the years I've known you, I've never seen you afraid of anything, not even when Thomas passed." Sarah paused, her hands stilling on the counter. "Fear doesn't help anyone, Lily. Just clouds the mind when you need it clear." "Maybe," Lily placed coins on the counter, "but sometimes it keeps you alive." "Not in my experience." The older woman peered at Sarah curiously. "And what experience would that be? You've been running this trading post for what, 8 years now?" Sarah met her gaze steadily. "People change, Lily. They adapt to what life gives them." "That they do." Lily gathered her purchases. "My Harold used to say, you can tell what a person's made of by how they handle the worst days, not the best ones." "Sounds like a wise man." "He was." Lily paused at the door. "Whatever happens in the coming days, Sarah, know that you've got friends in this town, more than you might think." After Lily left, Sarah stood at the counter, her mind turning over the conversation. She had worked hard to build a life in Blackwater Creek, a quiet, unremarkable life, far removed from the person she had once been. For 8 years, she had been simply Sarah Mason, widow and shopkeeper. Before that, she had been Thomas's wife, focused, on building their business and raising their daughter. But before Thomas, before Emily, she had been someone else entirely. Someone who wouldn't have hesitated to put a bullet through Nathaniel Wallace's black heart the moment he showed his face in town. Sarah glanced up at the Kentucky rifle above the door. It had been her father's, and his father's before him. A family heirloom passed down through generations of Hollisters, each one taught to respect its power and precision. Sarah had learned to shoot with that rifle when her legs were barely long enough to brace properly against the recoil. By 12, she could hit targets other grown men couldn't see. By 16, she had earned the nickname that would eventually appear on wanted posters across 3 states. Deadeye Hollister had been dead and buried for 20 years. Sarah Mason had made sure of that when she married Thomas and turned her back on her old life. But standing in her store, with the wind carrying rumors of approaching danger, Sarah felt the ghost of that young woman stirring inside her once more. The bell jangled again, pulling Sarah from her thoughts. Michael Harrington, Lily's grandson, stood in the doorway, his expression troubled. "Miss Mason," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Riders coming, 5 of them from the east." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened at Michael's words. "5 riders, you say?" The young man nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed nervously. "Coming up slowly from the east trail. Grandma sent me to warn you." Sarah moved from behind the counter with deliberate calm. "Thank you, Michael. Tell your grandmother to lock the hotel doors. No need to cause a panic, but best to be cautious." Michael hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Sheriff Cooper's not in his office. Deputy Mitchell's there, but he looks scared." "Of course he does," Sarah murmured almost to herself. She glanced up at the Kentucky rifle above the door, then back to Michael. "Go now! Warn who you can without causing a fuss." As the young man hurried out, Sarah moved to the window, positioning herself to observe the street while remaining partially hidden by the curtain. The eastern approach to Blackwater Creek followed the old mining road, winding between the dark pines before straightening for the final stretch into town. There they were, 5 riders moving at an unhurried pace. Dust rising behind their horses in the clear autumn air. Still too distant to make out faces, but their silhouettes told a story of their own. Men who rode like that, relaxed yet alert, weren't simple travelers or salesmen. They moved with the confidence of predators entering familiar hunting grounds. Sarah's mind raced through calculations. Cooper was somewhere in town, but not at his office. Mitchell was useless, barely 26 and inexperienced. Sullivan might have the courage to stand against the riders, but he lacked the skill. The rest of the townspeople would either hide or, worse, try to defend themselves without knowing what they were up against. 5 against 1 weren't odds Sarah would have chosen. But she'd faced worse in her younger days. She moved back behind the counter, her hands steady as she reached beneath it to where a loaded Remington revolver lay hidden. She didn't remove it, not yet, but knowing it was there provided a certain comfort. Then, with the same measured calm she'd displayed all morning, Sarah continued her inventory as if nothing had changed, only her ears straining for the telltale sound of approaching hoofbeats. Outside, the town continued its morning routine, unaware of the danger riding toward them. A few people hurried across the street, likely warned by Michael, but most went about their business oblivious to the approaching threat. Sarah saw Dr. Peterson emerge from her office, scanning the street with a concerned expression before disappearing back inside. The minutes stretched, each one pulling tighter than the last. Then came the sound she'd been waiting for. Hoofbeats, growing louder as the riders entered the town proper. Sarah didn't move, didn't look up from her ledger. But every muscle in her body tensed, ready. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped. Voices drifted through the window, too distant to make out words, but clear enough to hear the arrogance in their tone. A woman's startled cry, quickly muffled. A man's nervous greeting, then boots on the wooden sidewalk outside her store. The bell jangled as the door swung open, and Sarah finally looked up. 3 men entered, not the full 5, which meant the others were elsewhere in town. The one in front could only be Nathaniel Wallace himself. Tall and lean, with dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, he had the look of a man who'd found his true calling in violence. His black duster was dusty from the trail, and the red bandana around his neck had seen better days. But his gun belt was polished and well-maintained, the revolver holstered with practiced care. Flanking him were 2 others, one barely out of his teens, with a patchy attempt at a beard and fidgeting hands that kept straying to his gun belt. The other, a hulking presence with a face like weathered stone and dead eyes that swept the store's interior with professional assessment. "Morning," Wallace said, removing his hat with a mockery of politeness. "Fine establishment you have here, ma'am." Sarah set her pencil down, her expression revealing nothing. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" Wallace's mouth curved into what might have been called a smile on a different man. On him, it was merely a warning, like a rattlesnake's distinctive sound. "Just passing through, thought we might resupply before continuing our journey." "You'll find what you need on the shelves," Sarah replied evenly. "Cash only, no credit." The younger man snickered, but Wallace's false smile didn't waver. "Of course, we're good for it, ain't we, boys?" He moved farther into the store, his spurs jingling with each step. "Luke, why don't you help the lady gather what we need?" The young one, Luke, moved toward the shelves, grabbing items at random and piling them on the counter. Coffee, tobacco, ammunition, canned goods. His movements were jerky, excited, like a child allowed to run loose in a candy store. "Easy there," the larger man rumbled, his voice surprisingly soft for his size. "Don't need the whole damn store. Kid, just being thorough, Clay," Luke replied with a grin that showed too many teeth. Wallace approached the counter, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. There was curiosity there, and something else. A predator's assessment, searching for weakness. "Don't believe I caught your name, ma'am." "Mason," Sarah said. "Sarah Mason. Nathaniel Wallace." He extended his hand across the counter. When Sarah didn't immediately take it, his smile tightened. "Not very friendly, are you, Mrs. Mason?" "It's Miss," Sarah corrected, still not taking his hand. "And I prefer to keep business professional." Wallace withdrew his hand, the first hint of annoyance crossing his features. "Professional, is it? Well, I can respect that." His gaze drifted, up to the rifle mounted above the door. "That's a fine piece. Kentucky long rifle, if I'm not mistaken. A bit outdated, though, wouldn't you say?" "It serves its purpose," Sarah replied, tallying up the items Luke had piled on the counter. Wallace chuckled. "Which is what? Decoration. Those old muzzle loaders can't compare to modern firearms. 1 shot, and then you're in trouble." "1 shot. It's all you need if you know how to use it," Sarah said, her voice so matter-of-fact that it didn't register as a challenge until the words had already settled in the air. The atmosphere in the store shifted. Clay straightened slightly, his hand drifting closer to his holster. Luke froze mid-reach for a tin of tobacco. Wallace's smile vanished completely, replaced by a cold assessment. "Is that so?" Sarah didn't flinch under his gaze. "That'll be 23. $2.40. For a long moment, Wallace didn't move. Then deliberately, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a handful of coins, counting them onto the counter one by one. The sound of metal on wood filled the tense silence. Luke froze, then turned with a mocking grin. "Awful protective of an antique, ain't you? This thing probably doesn't even fire anymore." "It fires just fine," Sarah replied. "And it's not for sale." Luke's grin widened. "Didn't ask if it was for sale?" He reached up again, this time gripping the rifle as if to take it down. "Just curious what all the fuss is about." Sarah moved with a speed that surprised even Wallace. One moment she was behind the counter, the next she stood before Luke, her hand clamped around his wrist in a grip that made the young outlaw wince. "I said don't touch it." She didn't raise her voice, and didn't need to. The cold fury in her eyes was enough. Luke tried to jerk his arm away, but found himself unable to break her grip. Confusion and then anger flashed across his face. "What the hell? Let him go, Miss Mason," Wallace said quietly. It wasn't a request. Sarah held Luke's gaze for a moment longer, then released his wrist. The young outlaw stumbled back, rubbing the red marks her fingers had left. "Crazy bitch," he muttered. Clay chuckled softly. "Warned you about touching what ain't yours, kid." Wallace studied Sarah with newfound interest. The storekeeper's movements had been too quick, too confident for a simple shopkeeper. There was training there and experience. His curiosity deepened. "My apologies for the boy's manners," Wallace said. "He's still learning the finer points of civilized behavior." Sarah returned to the counter, continuing to wrap their purchases as if nothing had happened. "If that's all you need, gentlemen, I have other customers waiting." There were no other customers in sight, and all of them knew it. But Wallace simply nodded, gathering the wrapped parcels. "We'll be in town for a day or two," he said casually. "Perhaps we'll stop by again if we think of anything else we need." The threat was thinly veiled, but Sarah didn't acknowledge it. "Store closes at 6. Wallace laughed, genuinely amused by her composure. "You're an interesting woman, Miss Mason. Not easily rattled, are you?" "Life's too short for unnecessary worry," she replied evenly. "That it is." Wallace donned his hat, tipping it slightly in mock courtesy. "Clay, Luke, let's not keep the lady from her work." As the three men moved toward the door, Wallace paused, glancing back at the rifle. "Fine piece, that. My father had one similar." A pause. "He died with it in his hands. Too slow to reload when it mattered." Sarah met his gaze. "Some men are meant to die with guns in their hands. Seems fitting somehow." Something dangerous flickered in Wallace's eyes. There, and gone in an instant. Then the false smile returned. "Indeed it does, Miss Mason. Indeed it does." After they left, Sarah stood motionless behind the counter, listening to their boots on the wooden sidewalk, their voices growing fainter as they moved down the street. Only when she was certain they were gone did she allow her shoulders to relax. Slightly. That had been close, closer than she'd have liked. Luke's attempt to handle her rifle had nearly pushed her too far. The instinct to defend it wasn't just about protecting a family heirloom. It was about preventing Wallace from discovering just how well-maintained and ready for use that antique truly was. Sarah moved to the window, watching as Wallace and his men crossed the street toward Sullivan's saloon. Two other men, presumably the remaining members of the gang, were already tying their horses outside. All five would soon be in one place, likely gathering information, assessing the town's weaknesses, and planning. The encounter had confirmed what Sarah already suspected. These men weren't simply passing through. Blackwater Creek was their target, though whether for simple robbery or something more malicious remained to be seen. Their casual confidence, the testing of boundaries, the barely concealed contempt for the law, all pointed to men who viewed the town as prey, not as a brief stop on their journey. The bell above the door jangled again, and Sarah turned to see Sheriff Cooper entering the store. His expression was grim, his movements tense. "Mitchell told me they were here," he said without preamble. "You all right?" Sarah nodded. "They bought supplies, made some thinly veiled threats. Nothing direct." Cooper removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair. "Damn it! I was checking the outlying properties when they rode in." He looked at Sarah closely. "Mitchell said there was some trouble with the rifle." "Nothing I couldn't handle," Sarah replied. "The young one, Luke, got too curious. I discouraged him." Cooper's eyebrows rose slightly. "Discouraged him how?" Firmly. The sheriff sighed. "Sarah, these aren't ordinary troublemakers. They're killers. Professional, cold-blooded killers." "I'm aware." Sarah's tone was matter-of-fact. "Wallace made that quite clear without saying it." Directly, Cooper moved closer, lowering his voice, even though they were alone in the store. Listen to me. I've sent Mitchell to locate the nearest telegraph office that's still operating. With ours down, we need to get word to Helena or Carson City. But it'll take time for help to arrive, if it comes at all. So we're on our own, Sarah said, unsurprised. And now? Cooper's expression was troubled. They're over at Sullivan's now. I'm heading there next, trying to get a read on their intentions. Be careful, Sarah warned. Wallace is smarter than he looks. And the big one, Clay, he's dangerous. Watch everything, say little. Cooper gave her a curious look. You got all that from one encounter? Sarah didn't elaborate, simply holding his gaze until Cooper nodded slowly. I'll be careful, he promised. You should close up early today. And give them the satisfaction of knowing they've disrupted the town? Sarah shook her head. No. Business, as usual. That's what will unsettle them most, a town that isn't cowed by their presence. Cooper studied her for a long moment. You're not what you seem, are you, Sarah Mason? A ghost of a smile touched Sarah's lips. None of us are, Sheriff. Not really. After Cooper left, Sarah returned to her inventory, but her mind was racing. 5 men, all armed, all dangerous. Wallace clearly the leader, with Clay as his lieutenant. The young one, Luke, was impulsive, a hothead. The other 2 she hadn't encountered yet, but if they were riding with Wallace, they'd be cut from the same cloth. Outside, the town had grown quieter as word spread about the visitors. Fewer people on the streets, doors closing earlier than usual. Conversations hushed. Fear had arrived in Blackwater Creek, carried on the backs of 5 horses. Sarah glanced up at the Kentucky rifle, her mind drifting to that morning's practice. On the ridge, her fingers had remembered the weight, the balance, the precise pressure needed on the trigger. 20 years of peace hadn't erased those skills, merely buried them beneath layers of careful reinvention. Perhaps it was time to unearth them once more. Sullivan's saloon hummed with tense energy as Nathaniel Wallace and his men claimed a corner, and table, drinks in hand. The regular patrons kept their distance, nursing their beers with unusual focus, conversations muted and eyes averted. Marcus Sullivan moved behind the bar with forced casualness, polishing glasses while keeping a wary eye on the newcomers. Wallace lounged in his chair, seemingly at ease but missing nothing. His brother Jeremiah sat beside him, a leaner, sharper version of Nathaniel with eyes that constantly scanned the room. The Boyer brothers, Tom and Samuel, occupied the remaining chairs, with Luke standing restlessly nearby, still nursing. His wounded pride from the encounter at the trading post. Interesting town, Nathaniel observed, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Quiet, isolated. Jeremiah nodded slightly. Sheriff seems green, deputies even greener. Notice that, Wallace agreed. Makes things simpler. Luke leaned against the wall, his expression sour. That storekeeper woman needs to teach some manners. Wallace's gaze sharpened. The widow, Miss Mason. Yeah, I think she's something special. Got all high and mighty when I tried to look at that old rifle of hers. Luke rubbed his wrist where Sarah's grip had left marks. Grabbed me like she thought she could take me in a fight. Samuel Boyer, the older of the brothers, chuckled. Got manhandled by a shopkeeper, did you, boy? Losing your touch. Luke's face flushed with anger. She caught me by surprise is all. Won't happen again. No, Wallace agreed, his voice suddenly cold. It won't, because you'll stay clear of her store unless I say otherwise. His gaze swept across his men. All of you. Something's not right about that woman. Clay nodded slowly. Moved too fast, stood too steady, wasn't afraid. Exactly. Wallace drained his glass. And people who aren't afraid either have nothing to lose or know something we don't. Either way, it bears watching. The saloon doors swung open, and Sheriff Cooper entered, his stance casual, but his hand resting near his holster. The room fell silent as he approached the Outlaws' table. "Gentlemen," Cooper said, tipping his hat slightly. "Welcome to Blackwater." "Greek, I'm Sheriff William Cooper." Wallace gestured expansively. "Sheriff, join us for a drink. We were just admiring your fine town." Cooper remained standing. "Appreciate the offer, but I'm on duty. Just wanted to make myself known, let you folks know how we do things around here." "And how's that?" Jeremiah asked, his tone mildly curious but his eyes cold. "Peacefully," Cooper replied evenly. "Folks mind their business, respect others' property, and everyone gets along fine." Wallace smiled, refilling his glass from the bottle on the table. "Sound philosophy, Sheriff. We're just passing through, restocking supplies before heading north." "No intention of disturbing your peaceful town." Cooper nodded, his expression neutral. "Glad to hear it. How long will you be staying?" "A day or two at most," Wallace replied. "Horses need rest, and so do we. Been a long ride." "The hotel's comfortable," Cooper suggested. "Mrs. Harrington runs a clean establishment." Luke snickered, drawing a sharp glance from Wallace. "We'll keep that in mind," Wallace said smoothly. "For now, we're just enjoying Mr. Sullivan's fine." "Whiskey?" Cooper's gaze swept across the 5 men, memorizing faces, assessing threats. "Well then, enjoy your stay, gentlemen. If you need anything, my office is just down the street." As he turned to leave, Wallace called after him. "Sheriff? One question, if you don't mind." Cooper paused. "Yes?" "That storekeeper, Miss Mason. She's been in town a long time?" Cooper's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "About 20 years, give or take. Why do you ask?" Wallace shrugged. "Just curious. She seems different from the other folks we've met." "Sarah. Mason's a fixture in Blackwater Creek," Cooper replied carefully. "A respected businesswoman, keeps to herself mostly." "Widow," she said. Cooper nodded. "Her husband Thomas passed away some years back. Anything else you'd like to know about our residence, Mr. Wallace?" The challenge was subtle but clear. Wallace smiled, raising his glass slightly. "Just making conversation, Sheriff, getting to know the local color." After Cooper left, the Outlaws exchanged glances. "He knows who we are," Jeremiah muttered. "Of course he does," Wallace replied. "Question is, what does he plan to do about it?" Clay's soft voice cut through their speculation. "He's buying time. Sent the boy deputy out of town earlier, probably for help." Wallace nodded, unsurprised. "Won't matter. We'll be done and gone before help arrives." He turned to Luke, his expression hardening. "As for the widow Mason, you leave her be. Something doesn't sit right there, and I want to understand what it is before we make our move." Luke scowled, but nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but when the time comes, that rifle's mine. Always wanted a souvenir." Wallace didn't respond, his attention already elsewhere. His gaze drifted toward the window, where he could just see the corner of Mason's trading post down the street. The widow had piqued his curiosity, a dangerous thing to do with a man like Nathaniel Wallace. One way or another, he'd discover what Sarah Mason was hiding before he and his men were done with Blackwater Creek. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Blackwater Creek, the town held its breath. Most businesses had quietly closed early, their owners retreating behind locked doors. Only 3 establishments remained open: Sullivan's Saloon, where the Wallace gang continued to drink and observe, the sheriff's office, where Cooper maintained a watchful presence, and Mason's trading post, where Sarah continued business as if it were any ordinary day. Inside her store, Sarah served the few customers brave enough to venture out, noting the hushed voices and nervous glances toward the door. The Wallace gang's presence had cast a pall over the town, a heavy weight of anticipation. Not if, but when. Not whether, but how bad. Abigail Peterson entered just before 4 o'clock, her medical bag clutched tightly in one hand. The doctor's expression was strained, her movements precise with suppressed tension. "Sarah," she said quietly, approaching. "The counter. I need bandages and carbolic acid, whatever you have. Sarah raised an eyebrow but asked no questions as she gathered the supplies. Anything else? Abigail hesitated. Laudanum, if you have it, and whiskey, the good kind. Expecting trouble? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Preparing for it. Abigail's voice dropped lower. James saw 2 of Wallace's men scouting the bank earlier. They weren't even trying to be subtle about it. Sarah nodded, unsurprised. Cooper knows, I told him. He's gathering a few men, but... Abigail trailed off, the doubt clear in her voice. But they're not gunfighters, Sarah finished for her. She wrapped the medical supplies in brown paper, movements efficient and calm. How's Mitchell? Hasn't returned yet. Abigail accepted the package, placing coins on the counter. The telegraph lines are still down. We're isolated, Sarah. We've always been isolated, Sarah replied. Distance just makes it more obvious now. Abigail studied her friend's composed expression. You're not worried, are you? Sarah met her gaze. Worry doesn't solve problems, Abby. It just clouds judgment when you need it most. There's a difference between worry and caution. Abigail countered. Yes, and I'm being cautious. Sarah's hand disappeared briefly beneath the counter, a subtle reminder of the weapon hidden there. You should get back to your clinic. Be ready. If you're needed. Abigail hesitated, then nodded. What about you? Will you finally close early and show weakness? Sarah shook her head. I close at 6, same as always. After Abigail left, Sarah moved to the window, observing the street through the gap in the curtains. 2 of Wallace's men, the Boyer brothers, based on their similar builds, lounged outside the bank, making no effort to disguise their interest. In the building, they were sending a message, establishing dominance, letting the town know they could take what they wanted when they were ready. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. Amateur tactics. Professional robbers would have maintained the pretense of innocence until the last possible moment, striking when guards were down rather than telegraphing their intentions. This display was about fear as much as preparation, a psychological tactic to ensure compliance when the time came. The bell jangled, pulling Sarah from her thoughts. Sheriff Cooper entered, his expression grave. You heard? He asked without preamble. Sarah nodded toward the window. Saw. They're not subtle. No, they're not. Cooper removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in frustration. They want us on edge, jumping at shadows. It's working, Sarah observed. Town's already half shut down. Cooper moved closer, his voice dropping. I've deputized Sullivan and 3 others. Best I could do on short notice. They'll patrol tonight. Make sure the Wallace gang doesn't try anything under cover of darkness. Sarah didn't bother hiding her skepticism. 4 men with minimal experience against 5 professional killers. Those aren't encouraging odds, Cooper. Do you have a better suggestion? The sheriff's tone held an edge of frustration. Sarah was silent for a moment, considering. The bank's their target. Clear the money out. Hide it somewhere they wouldn't think to look. Already done, Cooper replied. Harrison took the cash box home after we spotted them watching the place. Not much. In it anyway. Payday for the lumber mill isn't until next week. Smart. What about the saloon? Sullivan's removed most of his better liquor and hid his cash box. Cooper's mouth tightened. But that's not going to satisfy men like Wallace. If they don't find what they're looking for, they'll take something else or someone. The implication hung in the air between them. Small frontier towns had seen it before. Women taken as hostages or worse, men executed as examples, buildings torched in frustration or simple cruelty. I know their type, Sarah said softly. They didn't ride all this way for a few dollars. And some whiskey. They want something more. Cooper studied her face. And what would that be? Entertainment. Sarah's voice was flat. The thrill of power. Men like Wallace feed on fear as much as money. You seem to understand them well. Sarah met his gaze steadily. I've known their kind before. Cooper didn't press further, but his eyes held a question, one Sarah had avoided answering for 20 years. Instead, he glanced up at the Kentucky rifle above the door. Mitchell mentioned what happened earlier with the young one. Luke said you moved pretty quick. Sarah's expression revealed nothing. Luke needs to learn about personal boundaries. That's not what I'm asking. Cooper leaned closer. Sarah, if things go bad, and I'm thinking they might, I need to know who I can count on, really count on it. For a long moment, Sarah was silent, weighing decades of careful anonymity against the growing certainty that Blackwater Creek faced a reckoning. Finally, she sighed. I can handle a gun, if that's what you're asking. Cooper's expression suggested. He suspected there was more to it than that, but he nodded. Good to know. Keep that Remington under your counter loaded. Sarah's eyebrow arched slightly. You knew about that? A ghost of a smile touched Cooper's lips. Been a sheriff here for 15 years, Sarah. Not much gets past me. He replaced his hat, moving toward the door. Keep your eyes open. If you see anything at all, that suggests they're making their move, fire a shot. The whole town will hear it. After Cooper left, Sarah continued her work, but her senses remained heightened, alert to every sound and movement from the street. Cooper had been right about one thing. The Wallace gang hadn't come all this way for a simple robbery. Men like them wanted spectacle, destruction, a story to tell in saloons across the territory, building their fearsome reputation. And Blackwater Creek, isolated and vulnerable, was the perfect stage for their performance. As dusk settled over the town, Nathaniel Wallace led his men from Sullivan's saloon toward the small hotel at the end of Main Street. The 5 outlaws moved with unhurried confidence, boots echoing on the wooden sidewalks, spurs jingling with each step. The few townspeople still on the street hurried to get out of their way, ducking into buildings or crossing to the opposite side. Inside the hotel lobby, Lily Harrington straightened as the door swung open, her expression carefully neutral as the outlaws entered. At the desk beside her, Michael tensed, his young face pale but determined. Gentlemen, Lily greeted them, her voice steady despite her 70 years. Looking for rooms? Wallace removed his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Indeed we are, ma'am. 5 of your finest, if you please. We have 3 available, Lily replied. 2 of you will need to share. Wallace's smile didn't reach his eyes. That'll do just fine. We're not particular. He placed coins on the counter. 1 night to start. Might stay longer if we find a town accommodating. Lily began the registration process, her handwriting as precise and unwavering as if she were serving ordinary travelers. Michael stood silently beside her, eyes downcast but shoulders rigid. Boy looks nervous, Jeremiah Wallace observed, leaning against the counter. Something troubling you, son? Michael swallowed but didn't respond. Lily's pen paused momentarily, then continued its steady progress across the page. My grandson doesn't mean to be rude, she said smoothly. He's shy around strangers. Is that so? Nathaniel studied the young man with predatory interest. Or is it something else? Sheriff Cooper, perhaps? Has he been spreading stories about us? We don't listen to stories, Lily replied, pushing the registry toward Wallace for his signature. In Blackwater Creek, we judge people by their actions. Wallace signed the book with a flourish. Wise policy, Mrs. Harrington. Lily Harrington. Mrs. Harrington. Wallace tipped his hat again. Rest assured, our actions will speak for themselves before we leave your fine establishment. The threat, thinly veiled, hung in the air as Lily handed over the room keys. Wallace distributed them among his men, then turned back to her. One more thing. That trading post down the street. Masons. Tell me about the owner. Lily's expression remained carefully neutral. Sarah, she's been here as long as I have. Runs a good business. Keeps to herself mostly. Husband. Passed years ago. Stray bullet during a dispute outside the saloon. Wallace nodded, absorbing this information. Seems like a woman of unusual capabilities. Lily's eyes narrowed slightly. Most women who survive out here develop capabilities, Mr. Wallace. Necessity demands it. Wallace smiled, recognizing the subtle rebuke. Indeed it does, Mrs. Harrington. Indeed it does. He gestured to his men. Get settled, boys. Meet downstairs in an hour. As the outlaws headed upstairs, Lily placed a hand on Michael's arm, squeezing gently to still his trembling. Only when they were out of earshot did she speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Go to Sarah's. Tell her they've been asking questions. When Michael hesitated, she added, through the back, don't let them see. You. At precisely 6 o'clock, Sarah Mason locked the front door of the trading post, turned the sign to closed, and extinguished the main lanterns. To anyone watching, it appeared she was following her usual routine. But beneath the counter, a canvas bag now held essential supplies, ammunition, bandages, dried food. Preparation, not panic. She had just finished her closing inventory when a soft knock came at the back door. Sarah's hand moved to Remington at her waist before she recognized Michael Harrington's distinctive pattern. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. She unlocked the door, ushering the young man inside quickly. What's happened? Michael's words tumbled out in a rush. They've taken rooms at the hotel. Wallace was asking Grandma about you, specifically you. Sarah's expression hardened. What did Lily tell him? Nothing important. That you've been here a long time, that you're a widow. Michael swallowed nervously. But he seems interested. Said you had unusual capabilities. Did he now? Sarah's voice was deceptively calm. Anything else? They're meeting downstairs in an hour. Planning something, I think. Michael hesitated. Grandma's scared, though she won't admit it. Says they've got the look of men who enjoy causing pain. Sarah didn't contradict this assessment. Go back to the hotel. Keep your grandmother safe. And Michael, she held his gaze, if trouble starts, you take Lily and hide in the root cellar. Don't try to be brave. After Michael left, Sarah moved through the store methodically, checking windows and doors, mentally cataloguing potential cover positions, sightlines, vulnerabilities. The front windows were a weakness, too exposed. The storage room at the back offered better protection, with only one entrance to defend. Her fingers traced the smooth wood of the counter as she considered her options. Cooper's deputized men would be watching the streets tonight, but that was little comfort. Well-intentioned amateurs against seasoned killers were poor odds indeed. As darkness settled over Blackwater Creek, Sarah climbed the stairs to her living quarters. The room was dim, lit only by a single lantern, shadows dancing on the walls. She moved to the wooden chest at the foot of her bed, kneeling before it with a sense of inevitability. The lid creaked as she opened it, revealing the carefully wrapped bundle within. Sarah unwrapped the oilcloth slowly, exposing the twin Remington. Revolvers with their pearl handles. Beside them lay the leather belt with its holsters, the material still supple after all these years of storage. For 2 decades, Sarah Mason had lived a quiet life, burying her past beneath layers of reinvention. Thomas had known the truth, of course, had loved her despite it, or perhaps because of it. Together they had built something peaceful, something honest. And then Thomas was gone, taken by a stray bullet in a meaningless dispute. And Emily before him, claimed by fever. All Sarah had left was the trading post and the life they'd built in Blackwater Creek. A life now threatened by men who killed for pleasure as much as profit. Sarah lifted one of the revolvers, feeling its weight settle into her palm like a long-absent friend. The pearl handle, yellowed with age, still fit her grip perfectly. She checked the action, the cylinder, the sights, all pristine, maintained even during the years they went unused. Some habits never died. A sound from the street below, caught her attention. Sarah moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains. Wallace and his brother Jeremiah were crossing toward the saloon, engaged in animated conversation. Behind them walked Clay, silent and watchful as always. She couldn't hear their words, but their body language told a story of anticipation. Whatever they were planning would happen soon, perhaps tonight, more likely tomorrow, when they'd had time to fully assess the town's weaknesses. Sarah watched until they disappeared into the saloon, then returned to the chest. The wanted posters lay at the bottom, yellowed and creased with age. She lifted the topmost one, studying the youthful face illustrated there. 25 years had passed since that likeness was drawn, but something of it remained in her features. A shadow of the young woman who had earned the name Deadeye. Sarah had been 17 when she killed her first man, a drunk who had murdered her mother and tried to do the same to her. By 19, she had developed a reputation as one of the deadliest shots in the Kentucky hills. By 21, circumstances and poor choices had led her to ride with Jameson's Raiders, a gang of bank robbers known for their precision and relative lack of bloodshed. But when Jameson had ordered the execution of hostages during their final job, Sarah had turned her legendary aim on him instead, saving the hostages, but earning a price on her head and the enmity of the remaining gang members. She'd fled west after that, eventually meeting Thomas in St. Louis and starting a new life far from her past. 20 years of peace had followed. 20 years of being simply Sarah Mason, shopkeeper's wife and later widow. 20 years of deliberately missing targets when forced to demonstrate her shooting during town celebrations, of keeping her skills hidden, of living an ordinary life. Now, as she refolded the poster and returned it to the chest, Sarah wondered if those years had been merely a respite rather than a true escape. Perhaps some pasts couldn't be outrun forever. She strapped on the gun belt, adjusting it to sit comfortably at her hips. The weight was familiar, almost comforting. She drew each revolver in turn, practicing the motion until her muscles remembered the rhythm, smooth and efficient. Like riding a horse, she thought, the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Finally, Sarah took down the Kentucky rifle from above her bedroom door, a twin to the one displayed in the store below. This one, however, showed signs of recent use, the stock polished by years of handling, the barrel meticulously maintained. She checked the loading, the percussion cap, and the sights. Everything is perfect, as always. This had been her first weapon, the one her father had placed in her small hands when she was just a child. A girl should know how to protect herself, he'd said, and a Hollister never misses. Those words had shaped her life, for better and worse. Sarah moved back to the window, rifle in hand. The street below was quiet now, most of the town buttoned, uptight against the night and the danger it might bring. Only the saloon showed signs of life, light spilling from its windows onto the dusty street. From her vantage point, she could just make out the shapes of Sullivan's temporary deputies, moving along their patrol routes, nervously watching the shadows. Too few, too inexperienced, too predictable. If Wallace was half the strategist, his reputation suggested he'd have marked their positions already, factored them into whatever plan he was concocting. Sarah raised the rifle, using the scope to scan the street more carefully. There, a shadow where no shadow should be. One of the Boyer brothers, watching from the alley beside the bank. And there, another figure on the roof of the hotel, barely visible but unmistakable to trained eyes. Luke, most likely, young and eager to prove himself. They were positioning themselves, establishing control of key vantage points, and preparing. Not for tonight, Sarah judged. Tonight was for surveillance, for learning the town's patterns. Tomorrow would bring the reckoning. She lowered the rifle, her decision made. Tomorrow, Nathaniel Wallace and his gang would discover that Blackwater Creek wasn't as defenseless as it appeared. Tomorrow they would learn why that ancient Kentucky rifle had never missed in Sarah Mason's hands. And perhaps tomorrow, after 20 years of careful anonymity, Deadeye Hollister would ride once more. In Sullivan's saloon, Wallace and his men gathered at their corner table, voices low as they discussed their plans. The evening crowd was thin, just a few regulars who kept to themselves, nursing drinks and avoiding eye contact with the newcomers. Behind the bar, Marcus Sullivan watched warily, a shotgun within easy reach. "Town's on edge," Jeremiah observed, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Right where we want them." Nathaniel nodded, sipping his whiskey. "Boyer boys in position?" "Tom's watching the bank," Clay confirmed. "Samuel's keeping an eye on the sheriff's office. Luke's on the hotel roof with a good view of the main street." "Good." Wallace leaned forward. "Tomorrow morning, we move. First the bank, not much there based on what we've seen, but enough to make it worth our while. Then the saloon's cash box. After that, we make our statement." The other men nodded, understanding the implication. The Wallace gang didn't just rob, they destroyed. Their reputation depended on leaving a trail of fear and devastation that would be remembered long after they'd moved on. "What about the sheriff?" Jeremiah asked. "Cooper?" Wallace smiled coldly. "He's careful, professional, but outnumbered and outgunned. We'll deal with him first, make an example." He glanced toward the bar, where Sullivan was pointedly not looking. "Their way. Then his deputies, such as they are." "And the widow?" Luke asked, his expression darkening. "That bitch needs to learn some manners." Wallace's eyes narrowed. "I told you to leave her alone." "Why?" Luke challenged, emboldened by whiskey and frustration. "She's just a shopkeeper with an antique rifle. Probably doesn't even know how to use it." Clay's soft voice cut through the tension. "She knows." All eyes turned to the large man, who rarely spoke unless he had something important to say. "What makes you say that?" Wallace asked, genuinely curious. Clay met his gaze steadily. "The way she stands, the way she watches, the way she grabbed the boy." He nodded toward Luke. "Not a shopkeeper's move, a fighter's move." Wallace considered, this tapping his fingers lightly on the table. "Maybe, or maybe you're seeing ghosts where there aren't any." But Clay wasn't convinced. "Something ain't right about her. Feels like recognition." "Recognition?" Jeremiah frowned. "You know her." "From somewhere?" Clay shook his head. "Not her specifically. Her kind." Wallace studied his lieutenant thoughtfully. Clay had been with him the longest, and his instincts had saved them more than once. If he sensed something unusual about the widow Mason, it was worth investigating. "Tell." "You what?" Wallace said finally. "After we've dealt with the sheriff, Luke can pay the widow a visit. See if there's more to her than meets the eye." He fixed the young outlaw with a hard stare. "But you follow my lead, understand? No going off half-cocked." Luke nodded reluctantly. "Yes, boss." "Good." Wallace drained his glass, setting it down. With a decisive thud. "Get some rest, boys. Tomorrow, Blackwater Creek learns why they should have feared the day we rode into town." As the outlaws dispersed to their assigned positions for the night, Wallace remained at the table, his mind turning over Clay's observations. The widow Mason was an anomaly, a woman alone on the frontier, running a business, facing down threats without visible fear. Such women existed, of course, forged by the harsh realities of frontier life. But there had been something in her eyes when she'd faced Luke. Not just courage, but confidence. The calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. Wallace's instincts, honed by years of survival in a violent world, whispered a warning. The widow Mason might be more than she appeared. And in his experience, surprises were rarely pleasant. Still, whatever secrets Sarah Mason might be hiding, tomorrow they would be revealed. And if she proved troublesome, well, one more body added to the Wallace gang's legacy would hardly matter. In the grand scheme of things, dawn broke over Blackwater Creek with a blood-red sky, painting the mountains in crimson and gold. The kind of sunrise old-timers called a warning. Red sky in morning, sailors take warning. In the mountains, such omens were taken seriously. Sarah Mason had been awake for hours, watching the night fade from her window, the Remington strapped to her hips and the Kentucky rifle close at hand. She'd slept little, her mind cycling through possibilities, strategies, contingencies. By the time the first rays of sunlight touched the eastern peaks, she had settled on her course of action. She moved quietly through her morning routine, washing, dressing, brewing coffee stronger than usual. Her movements were unhurried yet, precise, each action deliberate. The gun belt felt natural at her hips after all these years, like greeting an old friend. Sarah had thought those days behind her forever, yet here she was, preparing once more for violence. Downstairs, she unlocked the back door of the trading post, but left the front entrance closed, the closed sign still in place. Breaking routine would alert Wallace and his men that something had changed, better to maintain appearances while preparing for what was to come. Sarah positioned herself by the front window, curtains drawn just enough to allow her to observe the street without. Being seen, the town was beginning to stir, though many doors remained locked, windows shuttered. Cooper's deputies, Sullivan among them, had maintained their patrols through the night, but now looked haggard, shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Movement at the hotel caught her attention. Two figures emerged, the Boyer brothers, moving with purpose toward the bank. Behind them came Luke, rifle slung casually over his shoulder, his young face eager for the day's violence. They made no attempt to disguise their intentions now. The time for pretense had passed. Sarah's gaze shifted to the sheriff's office, where lights burned despite the growing dawn. Cooper would be making his preparations, such as they were. A good man, Sarah thought, but outmatched in this particular fight. She checked her weapons. One final time, both Remingtons fully loaded, the Kentucky rifle primed and ready. Then she waited, patient as a mountain lion watching its prey. The waiting ended sooner than expected. A gunshot shattered the morning quiet, followed by a shout, and then another shot. Sarah tensed, eyes scanning the street. The sound had come from the direction of the sheriff's office. She watched as townspeople who had ventured out scattered for cover, ducking into doorways or fleeing back to their homes. More gunfire erupted, a rapid exchange, then silence. Moments later, two figures emerged from the sheriff's office. Even at a distance, Sarah recognized Nathaniel Wallace's distinctive stance, the red bandana around his neck, visible in the morning light. Beside him walked Jeremiah, dragging something. No, someone. Sarah's breath caught as she realized they were dragging Deputy Mitchell by his collar, the young man's face bloodied, his body limp. Wallace pulled him into the middle of the street, then with casual brutality kicked him onto his back. Mitchell wasn't dead. Sarah could see him struggling weakly, trying to rise. Wallace placed a boot on his chest, pinning him to the ground. Then, with theatrical deliberation, he fired a single shot into the air. "People of Blackwater Creek," Wallace called, his voice carrying in the morning stillness. "Your attention, please." Doors cracked open slightly, curtains twitched at windows. The town was watching, hidden but attentive. "My name is Nathaniel Wallace," he continued, scanning the buildings as if he could see through walls to the frightened occupants within. "My men and I have business here today, simple business that needn't concern most of you." He gestured to Mitchell, still pinned beneath his boot. "Your deputy here made the unfortunate decision to interfere with that business, as did your sheriff." Sarah's fingers tightened on her rifle. "Cooper, where was Cooper?" As if in answer to her unspoken question, Clay emerged from the sheriff's office, half carrying, half dragging Sheriff Cooper. The lawman was conscious, but clearly injured, blood staining his left side. Now, Wallace continued. "We're reasonable men. We understand you're a small community just trying to get by. So here's what's going to happen. We'll conduct our business at the bank. No one interferes, no one else gets hurt. Then we'll be on our way." He paused, letting his words settle. "However, should anyone else decide to play the hero?" Wallace aimed his revolver at Mitchell's head. The deputy's eyes widened in terror. "No." The cry came from down the street. Dr. Abigail Peterson had emerged from her clinic, medical bag in hand. "Please, don't." Wallace turned, his expression one of mock surprise. "Well now, what have we here? A concerned citizen?" Abigail stood her ground, though her voice trembled slightly. "He needs medical attention. Let me help him." "Does he now?" Wallace pretended to consider this. "Perhaps you're right, Doctor. The boy does look a bit worse for wear." Sarah tensed, recognizing the false reasonableness in Wallace's tone. He was enjoying this, the power, the fear, the control. This wasn't just about money, it was about breaking the town's spirit. Wallace removed his boot from Mitchell's chest, taking a step back. "By all means, Doctor, attend to your patient." Abigail moved cautiously forward, eyes fixed on Mitchell. She knelt beside him, opening her medical bag. "Easy now," she murmured, checking his injuries. "You're going to be all right." Wallace watched this tableau with apparent amusement, then glanced toward Cooper, still held upright by Clay. "What do you think, Sheriff? Is the deputy going to be all right?" Cooper's face was pale with pain and anger, but his voice remained steady. "You won't. Get away with this, Wallace." "I believe I already have." Wallace turned back to Abigail. "How's our patient, Doctor?" "He needs proper care," Abigail replied, her voice stronger now that she was focused on her work. "I need to get him to my clinic." "All in good time." Wallace's gaze swept the street, settling on the trading post. "But first, I believe we're missing someone from our little gathering. Where's the widow Mason?" Sarah remained motionless behind her curtain, watching the scene unfold. Wallace was trying to draw her out, but why? What had prompted this specific interest in her? "Luke," Wallace called, "why don't you fetch Miss Mason? I'm sure she'd hate to miss all the excitement." The young outlaw grinned, clearly eager for the assignment. "With pleasure, boss." Sarah made her decision in an instant. Better to confront them on her terms than be dragged into the street. She moved swiftly to the front door, unlocking it quietly, then stepped back, rifle in hand, positioning herself where she'd have a clear line of sight. Luke approached the trading post, revolver drawn, cockiness evident in every step. He reached the door, trying the handle and finding it unlocked. His grin widened as he pushed it open. "Come on out, widow woman," he called. "Boss wants a word with you." Silence greeted him. The store's interior lay in shadows, the main lanterns unlit. Luke hesitated at the threshold, suddenly wary. "Don't make this difficult. I ain't asking twice." Still nothing. He took a tentative step inside, gun raised. "I know you're in here. Your Kentucky piece of junk won't save you now." The muzzle of Sarah's rifle pressed against the back of his head, cold and unmistakable. She had circled behind him through the storage room, approaching silently from his blind spot. "That piece of junk isn't what you should be worried about," Sarah said quietly. Luke froze, his breath catching. "You wouldn't dare. Wallace would—" "Wallace what?" Sarah's voice was calm, almost conversational. "Kill me? Seems like that's the plan anyway." Luke swallowed hard. "Look, just come outside, that's all. No one has to get hurt." "Someone always gets hurt," Sarah replied. "That's how men like you operate." She pressed the rifle harder against his skull. "Drop the gun. Slowly." Luke hesitated, weighing his options. Then reluctantly, he lowered his revolver, letting it clatter to the floor. "Kick it away," Sarah instructed. He complied, the gun skidding across the wooden floor into the shadows. "Now walk." Out the door, hands where everyone can see them, with The rifle at his back, Luke had no choice but to obey. He moved forward, stepping onto the porch with his hands raised. "Boss," he called, his voice higher than normal, "we've got a situation here." Wallace turned, his expression changing from amusement to surprise as he saw Luke standing there, hands up. Then his eyes narrowed as Sarah emerged behind him, the Kentucky rifle now aimed steadily at Wallace himself. The street fell silent. Cooper, despite his injuries, straightened slightly at the sight. Abigail paused in her ministrations to Mitchell, her eyes widening. From the saloon doorway, Marcus Sullivan watched with a mixture of astonishment and newfound respect. "Well now," Wallace said finally, recovering his composure. "Miss Mason, I was hoping you'd join us." Sarah's gaze remained fixed on him, the rifle unwavering. "Let them go, Wallace, the sheriff and the deputy. Let the doctor take them to her clinic." Wallace spread his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. "And why would I do that? Because until you do, your boy Luke here is in a very precarious position." Sarah's voice carried clearly in the morning air. "And because this piece of junk, as he called it, has never missed a shot in my hands." Wallace studied her for a long moment, assessing this unexpected development. The widow's stance, her confidence, the steady way she held the rifle, all confirmed Clay's suspicions. This was no ordinary shopkeeper. "Interesting proposition," Wallace said finally. "But I think you're outnumbered, Miss Mason, even with your impressive abilities." Sarah didn't blink. "Perhaps, but you'll be the first to die. I guarantee it." Something in her tone, the absolute certainty, the cold promise, gave Wallace pause. His eyes narrowed as he truly looked at her, seeing past the shopkeeper's facade to something else entirely. Recognition flickered across his face. "I know you," he said slowly, "or of you at least." Sarah remained silent, but something shifted in her expression, a minute tightening around the eyes, nothing more. Wallace's mouth curved into a smile of genuine surprise. "Well, I'll be damned. Deddy Hollister thought you were dead." A murmur ran through the onlookers. Cooper's head snapped up, his pained expression giving way to shock. Abigail gasped softly. Sarah didn't confirm or deny the accusation, but her silence was enough. Wallace laughed, a sound without humor. The famous Deadeye Hollister, hiding all these years as a shopkeeper in a backwater mining town. Now that's a story worth telling. His expression hardened. "Changed sides, have you? Become a defender of the innocent?" "I'm defending my home," Sarah replied evenly. "Nothing more, nothing less." Wallace seemed to consider this, then nodded almost imperceptibly. "Clay," he called, "let the sheriff go. Doctor, you may take your patients." Clay released his grip on Cooper, who staggered but remained upright through sheer force of will. Abigail quickly moved to support him, helping him to where Mitchell lay. "This changes nothing, you understand," Wallace continued, his eyes locked with Sarah's. "We still have business here. The only question is whether you're going to be smart enough to stay out of our way." Sarah's rifle remained trained on him. "And Luke?" Wallace shrugged. "A fair trade, the sheriff and deputy for my man." "When they're safely inside the clinic," Sarah countered. Wallace nodded, gesturing for Abigail to proceed. She helped Cooper to his feet. Then, with Sullivan rushing forward to assist, they managed to get Mitchell up as well. The three made their way slowly toward the doctor's clinic, Sullivan supporting Mitchell, while Cooper limped alongside, clutching his wounded side. Sarah watched their progress from the corner of her eye, never letting her main focus stray from Wallace. Only when they had disappeared inside the clinic did she lower the rifle slightly. "Now release Luke," Wallace demanded. Sarah gave the young outlaw a slight push forward. "Go, and next time, show some respect for other people's property." Luke stumbled away from her, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. He retrieved his gun from where one of the Boyer brothers had recovered it from inside the store, then moved to Wallace's side, glaring at Sarah with undisguised hatred. "You'll regret that," he muttered. I doubt it, Sarah replied calmly. Wallace placed a restraining hand on Luke's arm. Not now. His gaze remained fixed on Sarah. So, Deddy Hollister, I remember the stories. They say you never missed a shot, could hit a playing card edge on at 50 paces. His mouth curved in a mocking smile. They also say you turned on your own gang, shot Jameson in the back. Face to face, Sarah corrected, her first acknowledgement of her true identity. I've never shot anyone in the back. A matter of honor, is it? Wallace seemed genuinely amused. And here you are, 20 years later, still clinging to principles. He shook his head. You could have been famous, could have had your own gang, your own legend. I chose a different path. So you did. Wallace gestured expansively at the trading post behind her. All this, a quiet life in a quiet town, and now look, it's all coming apart anyway. His expression hardened. You can't escape what you are, Deadeye, no matter how long you hide. Sarah's gaze didn't waver. I'm not hiding anymore. A tense silence fell over the street as the two faced off, each measuring the other. Then Wallace nodded, as if coming to a decision. Boys, he called to his men, we've got a change of plans. Leave the bank for now. Miss Hollister here deserves our full attention. The Boyer brothers exchanged glances, clearly confused by this shift in strategy. Clay, however, nodded slightly, understanding his leader's thinking. You've made this personal, Sarah observed. Wallace smiled coldly. You made it personal when you decided to interfere, but I'm a reasonable man. One last chance to step aside. Let us take what we came for, and we'll leave this dusty little town in peace. We both know that's not true, Sarah replied. You've never left anything in peace. Perhaps not. Wallace's hand hovered near his holster. So what now, Deadeye? A shooting contest? You against my entire gang? Sarah's expression remained impassive. If that's what it takes. A whisper of movement from the hotel caught her attention. Michael Harrington stood in the doorway, a rifle clutched in his inexperienced hands. Behind him, Lily watched with a mixture of terror and determination. Other townspeople had emerged as well. James Peterson with a shotgun, Harrison Wells with an ancient pistol, even old Hank Tolliver with a woodcutting axe. Wallace noticed the gathering crowd and laughed. Look at that. The town's found its courage. He turned back to Sarah. Thanks to you, I imagine. Their very own legendary gunslinger comes out of retirement to save them. They don't need me to save them, Sarah replied. They just needed someone to stand up first. Wallace's amusement faded, replaced by cold calculation. 5 professional killers against a retired outlaw, and a handful of frightened townspeople. The odds still favored him heavily, but Sarah Hollister's reputation wasn't built on myth alone. If even half the stories were true, she was dangerous in ways few living people could claim to be. I'm offering you one last chance, Wallace said, his voice hardening, because I respect your reputation. Take these civilians and get out of the way. We'll do our business and be gone before sundown. Sarah shook her head. Can't do that, Wallace. For a moment, the street hung suspended in tense silence. Then Wallace sighed, as if genuinely regretful. Have it your way, then? His hand dropped to his holster with blinding speed, drawing and firing in one fluid motion. But Sarah had anticipated the move. She dove to the side, rolling behind a water trough as the bullet splintered the wood where she had stood. The peaceful morning erupted into chaos. Gunfire shattered the silence as Wallace's men opened fire, bullets thudding into the trading posts. Wooden facade. Sarah returned fire from behind the trough, her first shot catching one of the Boyer brothers in the shoulder, spinning him around with a cry of pain. Townspeople scattered, some running for cover, others raising their own weapons. In a ragged defense, Michael fired from the hotel doorway, his shot going wide, but forcing Luke to dive for cover. James Peterson's shotgun boomed, the scattered pellets keeping Jeremiah Wallace pinned behind a rain barrel. Sarah reloaded the Kentucky rifle with practiced efficiency, movements so ingrained they required no conscious thought. 20 years melted away in an instant. She was dead-eye Hollister once more, her senses sharpened to a razor's edge by the familiar rush of combat. A bullet whined past her ear, too close for comfort. Luke had worked his way to a better position, his youthful pride driving him to target the woman who had humiliated him. Sarah answered with a shot from one of her Remingtons, the bullet shattering a window frame inches from the young outlaw's head. "You can't win this, Deadeye," Wallace shouted from his position behind an overturned wagon. "Not even you can take down all of us." Sarah didn't waste breath responding. Instead, she used the moment to gauge positions. Wallace behind the wagon. Jeremiah pinned by Peterson's sporadic shotgun blasts. One Boyer brother was wounded, the other firing from the bank's doorway. Luke is trying to flank her from the left. And Clay. Where was Clay? The realization came too late. A shadow fell across her as the large man appeared seemingly from nowhere, having circled behind the buildings to approach from her blind spot. Before Sarah could swing her rifle around, Clay's boot connected with her hand, sending the weapon skittering across the dirt. Sarah rolled away from a second kick, drawing both Remingtons in one smooth motion. Clay was fast for his size, already adjusting his attack, a knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. They faced each other in a standoff, mere feet apart. "Nothing personal," Clay rumbled, his voice as quiet as ever despite the chaos around. "In them never is," Sarah replied. Remington's unwavering. Clay's eyes held a strange respect. "Heard stories about you. Never thought I'd see if they were true. Guess today's your lucky day." A hint of a smile touched the big man's lips. "We'll see about that." He lunged forward, knife flashing in the morning light. Sarah fired, but Clay had anticipated it, twisting his body so the bullet merely grazed his side. His massive form slammed into her, driving her backward. They crashed to the ground, Sarah's breath leaving her lungs in a painful rush. Clay raised the knife, his weight pinning her down. Sarah brought her knee up sharply, connecting with his midsection. He grunted but didn't release his grip. The knife descended. A gunshot cracked through the air. Clay froze, a look of surprise crossing his weathered features. A bloom of red spread across his chest, directly over his heart. He looked down at it almost curiously, then back at Sarah. "Guess not my lucky day. After all," he managed, before toppling sideways onto the dirt. Sarah scrambled to her feet, turning to see Sheriff Cooper leaning against the clinic doorway, his smoking revolver still raised, despite the obvious pain it cost him to stand. Their eyes met across the street. Acknowledgement, respect, a shared understanding of what had to be done. The brief moment of connection shattered as Wallace's enraged voice rose above the gunfire. "Clay!" The gang leader's face contorted with genuine grief and fury as he saw his lieutenant lying motionless in the dirt. "You'll pay for that, all of you." His previous calculation gave way to blind rage. Wallace broke cover, firing wildly as he charged toward Sarah. Bullets kicked up dust around her feet as she dove for the Kentucky rifle, rolling to a firing position in one fluid motion. Time seemed to slow. Wallace's face twisted with hate and loss, his finger tightening on the trigger, the red bandana at his throat, bright as blood in the morning sun. Sarah exhaled slowly, just as her father had taught her decades ago on the Kentucky hillside. "Center your target. Squeeze. Don't. Pull!" The ancient rifle roared. Through the haze of smoke, Sarah saw Wallace stagger, a look of profound disbelief crossing his features as he registered the bullet hole precisely centered in his chest. His revolver slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, thudding into the dirt. "Impossible," he whispered, sinking to his knees. "That antique never misses." Sarah finished for him, rising slowly to her feet. "Not in my hands." Wallace's eyes held hers for a moment longer, rage giving way to a strange acceptance. Then he pitched forward onto the street, dust rising around him like a shroud. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader fall, lost whatever resolve had driven them. Jeremiah Wallace, now wounded himself from Peterson's shotgun, raised his hands in surrender. The uninjured Boyer brother followed suit. Only Luke continued to fire wildly, screaming obscenities until a bullet from Michael Harrington's rifle, a lucky shot from the inexperienced young man, caught him in the leg, ending his resistance. As suddenly as it had begun, the gunfight was over. The morning air, moments ago filled with gunfire and shouts, fell eerily silent. Smoke drifted across the street, the smell of gunpowder sharp and acrid. Sarah stood amid the chaos, the Kentucky rifle still warm in her hands, her breathing steady despite the exertion. She surveyed the aftermath, 2 of Wallace's gang dead, the others wounded or surrendered. Among the townspeople there were injuries, but miraculously no fatalities. Cooper limped toward her, clutching his wounded side. "Never misses, huh?" he said, nodding toward the rifle. Sarah met his gaze. "Not when it matters." Around them the town of Blackwater Creek stirred to life once more. Abigail emerged from her clinic, already directing people to bring the wounded inside. Sullivan and Harrison began securing the surviving outlaws. Lily Harrington wrapped a protective arm around her grandson, pride and relief mingling in her weathered face. Cooper's eyes held a question as he looked at Sarah. "Dead-eye Hollister," he said quietly. "All these years—" Sarah nodded once, acknowledging the truth that could no longer be hidden. "All these years." "What happens now?" Cooper asked, his tone suggesting the question encompassed more than just the immediate aftermath. Sarah looked around at the town she had called home for 20 years, the people she had lived alongside, the life she had built. Her secret was out, her past revealed. Would they see her differently now? Would she be forced to move on once again, start over somewhere new? As if in answer to her unspoken questions, Lily Harrington approached, her chin held high. "Miss Hollister," she said formally, then her expression softened. "Sarah, thank you." One by one, the townspeople gathered around her, offering nods of respect, quiet words of gratitude. Not fear or judgment, but acceptance. "Seems to me," Cooper said, observing this, "that Blackwater Creek still needs its trading post, and its trading post still needs its owner, whatever name she goes by." Sarah felt something tight within her chest begin to loosen. A tension she had carried for 20 years, finally releasing its grip. The Kentucky rifle, her father's legacy, felt right in her hands once more, not as a tool of violence, but as a symbol of protection, of home. "Sarah Mason suits me just fine," she said at last. "Always has." The point of no return had arrived and passed. Blackwater Creek would never be the same, but perhaps that wasn't such a bad thing after all. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Blackwater Creek as the town slowly recovered from the morning's violence. The bodies of Nathaniel, Wallace and Clay had been moved to the undertakers, their final resting places to be unmarked graves on the hillside. The surviving members of the gang, Jeremiah Wallace and the Boyer brothers, were locked in the sheriff's makeshift cells, awaiting transport to the territorial prison once Mitchell was well enough to travel. Inside Dr. Peterson's clinic, Abigail moved from patient to patient, her skilled hands treating wounds with quiet efficiency. Cooper sat on the edge of an examination table, grimacing as she changed the bandage on his side. "You're lucky," she told him, inspecting the wound. "The bullet passed clean through. Another inch to the right, and we'd be having a very different conversation." Cooper managed a wry smile. "Seems luck was with a lot of us today." Abigail glanced toward the other room, where Mitchell lay sleeping, his injuries serious but no longer life-threatening. "Not all of this was luck, Sheriff." She secured the fresh bandage and stepped back. "Some of it was having the right person In the right place at the right time. Cooper nodded, his thoughts turning to Sarah Mason. No, Sarah Hollister. The revelation of her true identity still struck him as impossible, yet in retrospect, the signs had always been there. The way she moved, the careful way she observed everything, her unnatural calm in the face of danger. "Deadeye, Hollister," he murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. "All this time?" Abigail wiped her hands on a clean cloth. "I've heard stories about her since I was a girl back east. Never imagined I'd be treating patients alongside a living legend. She's not just a legend, Abby. She's our neighbor, has been 20 years. Cooper eased himself into his shirt, wincing at the movement. "Question is, what happens now?" Abigail considered this. "That depends on how the town reacts and on Sarah herself." "She saved a lot of lives today," Cooper said, buttoning his shirt slowly. "Mine included." "Yes," Abigail agreed, "but people fear what they don't understand, and a former outlaw living in their midst, that's going to take some getting used to." Cooper stood carefully, testing his balance. "Then I suppose we'd better help them understand." Sarah Mason stood behind the counter of her trading post, methodically repairing the damage from the morning's gunfight. Bullets had splintered the wooden shelves and shattered several windows. Merchandise lay scattered across the floor, some of it beyond salvaging. The ancient Kentucky rifle had been returned to its place of honor above the door, cleaned and oiled after performing its duty. The bell above the door jangled as Marcus Sullivan entered, carrying a wooden toolbox. His face showed the weariness of the day, but his eyes held new respect as he looked at Sarah. "Thought you might need some help with those windows," he said, setting down the toolbox. "Got some spare glass at the saloon." Sarah paused in her work. "Thank you, Marcus." "Wasn't necessary," Sullivan shrugged. "Seemed like the least I could do, considering." He glanced around at the damage. "Place took quite a beating. Nothing that can't be fixed." Sarah resumed sweeping shattered glass into a pile. Sullivan watched her for a moment, then cleared his throat. "So, Deddy Hollister." Sarah didn't look up. "Sarah Mason will do just fine." "Right." Sullivan nodded, then began removing the broken glass from one of the window frames. They worked in silence for a while, each focused on their task. Finally, Sullivan spoke again. "My pa used to tell stories about Jameson's raiders. Said they were the smartest gang in 3 states. Hit banks like ghosts, in and out, before anyone knew what happened." Sarah said nothing, but her hands stilled slightly. "Also said they never killed unless they had to," Sullivan continued, "until that last job in Missouri. Story goes that Jameson lost his mind, was going to execute the hostages, but his best shooter turned on him, put a bullet right between his eyes." Sullivan looked up from his work. "Saved a dozen lives that day, including a 10-year-old boy." Sarah met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "History's full of stories, Marcus. Most of them get twisted in the telling." "Maybe so." Sullivan resumed his work. "But that boy was my cousin. His pa was the bank manager in Westfield. So forgive me if I put some stock in that particular story." Sarah absorbed this information, the implications settling over her like a physical weight. For 20 years, she had believed her past actions had been buried, forgotten by all but a few. Now she was confronted with the reality that her choices had rippled outward, touching lives she had never known. "I didn't know," she said finally. Sullivan nodded. "No reason you would have. Point is, before today, I thought Deadeye Hollister was probably dead somewhere. Lot of people did. But knowing you've been here all along, living a quiet life, running an honest business," he gestured around the trading post, "well, that changes things. Makes me think people can really start over." Sarah considered his words. "It's not always that simple. Nothing worth doing ever is." Sullivan held up the new glass pane. "Mind giving me a hand with this?" As they worked together to repair the window, Sarah found herself thinking about the strange turns life took. 20 years ago, she couldn't have imagined standing shoulder to shoulder with a saloon owner, discussing her past without fear or shame. 20 years ago, she had been running. She only thought to put as much distance as possible between herself and the life she was leaving behind. Now somehow she has come full circle. The past had caught up with her, yet instead of destroying the life she had built, it had revealed connections she never knew existed. The bell jangled again as Lily Harrington entered, followed by her grandson, Michael. The young man's arm was bandaged where a bullet had grazed him during the fight, but he stood tall, meeting Sarah's gaze with newfound confidence. "Sarah," Lily said, her tone formal yet warm, "the town council has called an emergency meeting. They've asked for you to attend." Sarah stiffened slightly. "The council?" "Yes." Lily's expression gave nothing away. 7 o'clock, at the church. Sullivan. He paused in his work, glancing between the two women. "What's this about, Lily?" The older woman shrugged. "Official town business. That's all I know." She turned to leave, then paused. "You should come too, Marcus, as a business owner." After they left, Sullivan gave Sarah a questioning look. "Town council doesn't usually meet unless there's something important to discuss, like what to do with an infamous outlaw in their midst," Sarah said, her voice dry. Sullivan frowned. "That's not fair. You've been here 20 years. You're as much a part of this town as anyone. People's memories get selective when they're afraid." Sarah set down her broom. "And today gave them plenty of reasons to be afraid. You saved this. Town, Sarah. They know that. Do they?" She shook her head. "Or do they see Deadeye Hollister, the outlaw with a price on her head? The woman who rode with Jameson's raiders?" Sullivan had no immediate answer for that. Finally he said, "Guess we'll find out at 7. The old church building had been restored after the fire 3 years ago, though it still bore scars of the blaze. Blackened beams were visible in the ceiling, and the replacement pews didn't quite match the few originals that had been salvaged. But it served its purpose as both a place of worship and the town's meeting hall. By 6:45, it was nearly full. Word of the emergency council meeting had spread quickly, and it seemed most of Blackwater Creek's residents had decided to attend. They sat in family groups, voices hushed as they discussed the day's events, glancing periodically toward the door. Sheriff Cooper arrived early, moving stiffly but under his own power. Abigail accompanied him, insisting he take one of the front pews to avoid standing. Sullivan was there too, freshly washed and wearing his good coat, a sign of the meeting's importance. Gradually, the other business owners filed in. Harrison from the post office, Peterson from the school, Lily Harrington representing the hotel. At precisely 7 o'clock, Sarah Mason entered. The church fell silent as she walked down the center aisle, her steps measured and unhurried. She had changed into a clean dress, her chestnut hair neatly braided, but the gun belt at her hips broke with propriety. The twin Remingtons gleamed in the lantern light, a clear statement that while she was willing to face the town's judgment, she would do so on her own terms. She took a seat in the last row, her back to the wall, a position that gave her a clear view of both exits and every person in the room. Old habits. Mayor Thomas Fletcher, a portly man who ran the town's only feed store, called the meeting to order. At 65, Fletcher had been mayor for over a decade, more by default than ambition. He cleared his throat nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the unusual circumstances. "Friends and neighbors," he began, "we find ourselves in an extraordinary situation. Today, our town faced a threat unlike any in recent memory. The Wallace gang came to Blackwater Creek with the intention of robbery, and I think we can all agree, worse." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the church. Thanks to the bravery of Sheriff Cooper, Deputy Mitchell, and others who stood against them, that threat has been neutralized. Fletcher dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief. "But the day's events have also brought to light certain revelations about one of our own." All eyes turned towards Sarah. "For 20 years," Fletcher continued, "Sarah Mason has run the trading post, serving this community with honesty and diligence. Many of us, myself included, considered her a friend, a neighbor, a valued member of Blackwater Creek." Sarah's expression remained impassive, though she noted his use of the past tense. "Today, we learned that before she came here, Sarah Mason was known by another name. Dedai Hollister, a member of the notorious Jameson's Raiders." Fletcher's voice shook slightly. "A wanted outlaw with a price on her head." The church erupted in whispers and exclamations. Fletcher raised his hands for quiet. "The town council has convened this meeting to decide how to proceed. This is a matter that affects us all, and all voices should be heard." He adjusted his spectacles nervously. "Sheriff Cooper has requested to speak first." Cooper rose slowly, favoring his injured side. He surveyed the crowded church before speaking, his voice steady and assured. "Most of you know I came to law enforcement late in life. Before I pinned on a badge, I rode with the Texas Rangers for 12 years. He paused, letting this previously unshared information sink in. "In that time, I hunted men like Nathaniel Wallace across 3 states. I've seen what real outlaws can do to a town." He turned slightly, meeting Sarah's gaze across the room. "Sarah Mason, or Sarah Hollister if you prefer, is not that kind of outlaw. Never was. Jameson's Raiders were bank robbers, yes, but they had a code. No killing unless absolutely necessary. No harming women or children. No excessive violence." Cooper shifted his weight, wincing slightly. "But more importantly, when Jameson himself broke that code, when he decided to execute hostages during their last job, it was Sarah who stopped him. She turned on her own gang leader, shot him dead, saving those hostages at the cost of everything she had built." The church was silent now, every person hanging on Cooper's words. "That woman sitting there," he pointed to Sarah, "could have let Wallace and his men rob us blind today, could have stayed hidden in her store, protected herself and no one else. Instead, she stood up, put herself between killers and this town. Used skills she'd kept hidden for 20 years to save lives that, frankly, some of us didn't do enough to protect." Cooper's gaze swept the assembled townspeople, many of whom looked away, uncomfortable with this blunt assessment. "Now you want to sit in judgment?" His voice hardened. "Fine. Judge her by what she did today. Judge her by 20 years of honest living. Judge her by the lives she saved, including mine." He sat down carefully. "That's all I have to say." Mayor Fletcher cleared his throat. "Thank you, Sheriff. Does anyone else wish to speak?" To everyone's surprise, Michael Harrington stood. The young man's face flushed as all eyes turned to him, but he squared his shoulders. "I've lived in Blackwater Creek my whole life," he began, his voice initially uncertain but growing stronger. "Never been anywhere else. Always thought it was, well, boring, to be honest." A few chuckles greeted this admission. "Always dreamed of having adventures somewhere else." Michael turned toward Sarah. "Today I fired a gun in anger for the first time. Hit one of Wallace's men, scared me half to death." He took a deep breath. "But I did it because I saw Miss Mason, Miss Hollister standing her ground, not running, not hiding, fighting for our town, our home." He looked around the church. "If she can do that, someone who came from somewhere else, who chose us, then how can we turn our backs on her now?" Lily Harrington beamed at her grandson with undisguised pride. One by one, others rose to speak. Marcus Sullivan recounted the story of his cousin, saved during the Westfield bank robbery. Abigail Peterson spoke of Sarah's calm competence during crises, how she had always been the first to help when medical emergencies arose. Even James Peterson, normally reticent, described how Sarah had taught several of the older school children basic wilderness survival skills during the previous winter. As the testimonials continued, Sarah sat quietly, her expression giving little away. But beneath her composed exterior, something was shifting, a weight lifting, a tension releasing. For 20 years she had lived with the constant fear of discovery, of rejection, of being forced to flee once more. Now, faced with the reality, she found it strangely liberating. Whatever happened next, the need for secrets was over. Finally, when all who wished to speak had done so, Mayor Fletcher turned to Sarah. "Miss Mason, or do you prefer Miss Hollister?" Sarah stood, her voice clear in the hushed church. "Mason. Sarah Mason is who I am now, who I've been for 20 years. Fletcher nodded. "Miss Mason, would you like to address the town?" Sarah surveyed the faces before her, friends, neighbors, people she had lived alongside for 2 decades. Some looked supportive, others uncertain, a few openly suspicious. All waited for her words. 20 years ago, I made a choice," she began. "I chose to leave behind a life that had brought pain to others, even if that wasn't my intention. I chose to start over, to build something honest and good." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Thomas Mason knew who I was when he married me, knew my past, my skills, everything I'd done. He believed people could change if given the chance." Her voice softened slightly at the mention of her late husband. "He was right." Sarah's gaze moved to the Kentucky rifle she had brought with her, now resting against the pew beside her. "My father gave me this rifle when I was 8 years old. Taught me to shoot, to hunt, to protect myself in a world that wasn't always kind. Those skills kept me alive when I had nothing else." She ran her fingers lightly along the rifle's aged stock. "Today, they helped keep this town alive. I don't regret that. But I understand if my presence here makes some of you uncomfortable, now that you know the truth." Sarah straightened, meeting the mayor's gaze directly. "If the council decides I should leave Blackwater Creek, I will do so. But know this, whether I stay or go, what happened today was necessary. The Wallace gang would have destroyed this town, killed indiscriminately, taken whatever they wanted. Sometimes standing against that kind of evil requires certain capabilities." Her voice strengthened with conviction. "I'm not ashamed of what I did today, and I'm not ashamed of the woman I've become over these 20 years. A long silence followed. Her words. Then, to everyone's surprise, Lily Harrington stood up. "Mayor Fletcher, I believe the council should vote now," she said firmly, "and I move that the vote be public, so everyone knows where each member stands." Fletcher looked uncomfortable, but nodded. "Very well. The question before the council is whether Sarah Mason should be permitted to remain in Blackwater Creek, given the revelations about her past." He glanced around at the other council members. "Those in favor of allowing her to stay, please raise your hands." Lily's hand shot up immediately. Sullivan followed, then Harrison, then Peterson. Finally, after a moment's hesitation, Fletcher himself raised his hand. "The vote is unanimous," he announced, a note of surprise in his voice. "Sarah Mason is welcome to remain in Blackwater Creek for as long as she wishes." A collective exhale seemed to pass through the church. Tension drained from the room, replaced by a strange mix of relief and newfound respect. Sarah felt something unexpected well up inside her, not just acceptance, but belonging. After 20 years of careful distance, of keeping parts of herself hidden away, she was finally truly home. As the meeting dispersed, people approached her one by one. Some offered quiet words of thanks, others simply a nod of acknowledgement. Cooper limped over, a half-smile on his weathered face. "Well, that's settled," he said. "Though I suspect the stories about Deadeye Hollister are going to get even more exaggerated now." Sarah shook her head, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Let them talk. Stories have a way of fading with time." "Some do," Cooper agreed. Others become legends. He nodded toward her rifle. Like a widow's ancient rifle that never misses. Sarah picked up the Kentucky rifle, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. Her father's voice seemed to whisper from across the years, "A Hollister never misses." Not a burden now, but a legacy. One she could finally embrace. "Legends have their place," she said softly, "but I prefer reality." Outside the church, the stars were emerging in the clear Montana sky. The same stars she had followed west with Thomas, full of hope for a new beginning. The same stars that had witnessed her darkest moments and her greatest joys. The same stars that would now watch over Blackwater Creek as it healed from today's violence and grew stronger for having faced it together. Sarah Mason walked home through the quiet streets, the Kentucky rifle cradled in her arms not as a weapon, but as a symbol of who she had been and who she had become. The trading post would need repairs, windows to replace, stock to replenish. Life would go on, different now that her secret was known, but perhaps more authentic for it. As she reached her store, Sarah paused, looking back at the town settling in for the night. For the first time in 20 years, she felt completely present, completely herself. No more hiding, no more fear of discovery, just Sarah Mason, shopkeeper of Blackwater Creek, and occasionally, when necessary, Dead-Eye Hollister, the woman, whose ancient rifle never missed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new beginnings, but tonight, under the vast Montana sky, that was more than enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.